Many days had passed since Eijlam and Fionna left for Drustenloch. Whether it was from some unrealized fear or dedication to duty, Roevash stubbornly refused to let Naalin within arm's length since the pair had gone. Naalin would watch from a distance with a degree of criticism in her eyes as Roevash trained his human recruits. He noticed her there and wondered how much she knew about combat and fighting styles. She seemed too small and frail to him. Naalin would have shared her thoughts had he only asked. She had tried to get his attention when he was not around the men, but he always seemed to somehow vanish around a corner. How one so large could disappear so thoroughly, I will never know. Naalin grumbled in frustration as Roe evaded her for the 100th time. It became apparent to her that he did not desire her company. The men were curious about this tiny woman with the wild hair that came back with them from the south. "She is Lady Fiona's kin," was all the commander would say. This meant off limits to the men, and they knew it by the tone in his voice. Commander Roevash had no intentions of letting anyone near her. He did not know why he felt a rising anxiety in securing her welfare among the men. He decided this was just dedication to his duty. Soon Fionna will be back, and this will not be an issue, Roevash thought to himself as he took a deep breath to collect his senses and get back to the task of running a military training post. Roevash must have some giant man-like thunderbug stuck up his... never mind. After suffering so much desolation in his own life, you would think Roevash would know better. I guess we're going to find out. This is Karleigh reading for you Tales of Elderlorn, Book 1. Today we are on Chapter 30, Half Darjal'n. Roevash had so carefully carried Naalin to King Elendil's palace to save her life. Then he carried her many leagues on the road to this place full of strangers with strange customs. Naalin had enjoyed his company and thought they were, at the very least, friends. Not understanding why he no longer cared to communicate, Naalin finally retreated in frustration to Fiona's private quarters. She tried to pretend it didn't hurt, but her heart felt broken. She could not let Roevash's actions mar her. When she thought about it, she didn't honestly know him after all. With so much time on her hands in waiting for Fionna and EJ to get back to the fort, Naalin decided to explore the place. She found herself a pair of decent elven daggers that had long been abandoned to time and allowed to grow dull from misuse. One of the daggers was in a box buried under a pile of junk. The other one was stabbed into the wall. She expertly jerked it loose. A paper it was holding up fell to the floor. Naalin felt disgusted at the thoughtless abuse that this beautiful set of blades had endured throughout time. Naalin reverently carried them back to Fiona's private quarters. She worked cleaning and sharpening the set. "It feels right that I should own these now," Naalin smirked. These were her weapons of choice after all, and right now they were the one thing that felt familiar. The beautiful daggers shone brightly in her hands as they came back to life from the abuse they had suffered. How ironic, Naalin thought, as she named them Bane Thorith, which means foul beauty in her native tongue. She felt an affinity with the blades that were once lost and now found. I will be ready for this new land after today, Naalin said out loud in mild agitation. She was, after all, a fighter in her own right, having joined with the king's forces for a time. She had shared her long memory. He must have heard it from Fionna by now, Naalin thought of Roevash, and yet he abandons me as worthless. For a moment, Naalin stared at the razor-sharp edge of the blade and felt the full depths of her loneliness. She growled in anger at herself for letting such thoughts run through her mind unbridled. I am not so weak, Naalin scowled as she sheathed the blade. She was free to choose her own life. She would not be kept in this foreign place among humans. Naalin was sure she could find more elvenkin, even though Fionna had said there were none. She was, after all, living proof they could be wrong. Naalin decided to say goodbye when her clan sister returned. She didn't want to seem discourteous, after all. They had risked much to save her. Naalin tested her new daggers by cutting off the ragged tangles of her hair. The hair was a reminder of the evil sleep she had been trapped in, and Naalin wished to look normal again. Within a short time, her curly hair was finally free. During her explorations of the fort, Naalin found that outside the eastern gate there was a quiet, cool river. She bathed herself, and her hair softened. By the time she was done, her dimpled face was surrounded by light brown, wispy curls. Naalin didn't realize that the men would make remarks about her nakedness. As she made her way back to Fionna's room, she stared back menacingly at them, and they fell silent in her glare. What she knew of human men was that they were never to be trusted. Naalin was so desiccated when they first found her. She seemed smaller than her actual height. But now she was stronger, and what she had been wearing was dirty and completely worn. Naalin dug through Fionna's wardrobe looking for something that would fit. She found a nice dress that was not too long in the hemline. What a fright I must have seemed. Naalin looked in the mirror and smiled at the transformation. Naalin stubbornly decided to be the gracious one, regardless of her treatment. She would move on with her life, and Roevash could make himself part of it if he so chose to be a true friend. At this point, she didn't care anymore what anyone thought, as she made plans for herself. Naalin couldn't know the struggle that Roe felt when he didn't see her around the fort anymore. He sat alone in front of his hearth, which had become a habit ever since he was first assigned to this post. The only variation in his long, lone life was that Fionna appeared out of nowhere to exasperate him. He glowered to himself at the thought of those days as he stared into the relaxing flames. Roevash sipped at his cool tankard of ale and tried not to think about how the room seemed too quiet and routine. He had grown used to the family noise in his life, and it felt strangely empty. He wondered about the small girl that was Fionna's kin. His ensign was ordered to give him daily reports, which he had faithfully carried out for the past month and a half. Roe was uncomfortable with not seeing to her himself, but she proved to be too much of a distraction for him, so he resolved to look in on her if she remained scarce, but just as a courtesy. It is my duty, after all. Roevash scowled to himself as he swigged down a huge gulp from his tankard. There was a quiet knock at the door. Naalin boldly entered before Roevash could even speak. His eyes riveted on her as she walked over to the empty chair that was always Fiona's and sat down by the fire. She was wearing his favorite dark green velvet dress that had delicate gold strings tied around the sleeves and waistline. He felt the same sense of sick panic in his gut as the day he first met Fionna. Roevash was relieved when Fionna turned out to be perpetually bad-tempered, so they became good friends, and Roe preferred it that way. This one just quietly stared back at him with giant gray-green eyes. Roevash was too stunned to talk. Not knowing what else to do, he stupidly shoved his tankard of ale at her. Naalin sipped a bit and smiled at him with the rim of the glass held close to her delicate, wet lips. She had the sweetest face he had ever seen. He found that he forgot to breathe. Roevash tried to smile back, but his lips suddenly felt too big and oddly artificial. He struggled to gain control of his faculties. A strange dizziness pressed in behind his ears, threatening to overtake him. "I am glad you are well." Roevash spoke calm and precise in his own Elvish dialect, hoping he seemed normal. "Your eyes look bigger. With your hair cut off." He made hand gestures to emphasize his words. Much to his delight, Naalin laughed, breaking the tension growing inside his chest. He couldn't help but genuinely smile despite his impairments. Naalin was glad to see his true face again. Their eyes sparkled together in the firelight as they gazed silently at each other. Roe panicked and quickly turned his eyes to the comforting fire in the hearth. "I was thinking about how I am alone, even in my own family. My brother and Fionna are so new in this life compared to all I have experienced. I mean, long memories. I am speaking of long memory." Roevash gasped for air, glad that she didn't know what he was just saying because it came out all wrong, and he wasn't sure what he really meant to say anyway. "Oh, Lord, save me." Roevash mumbled to himself and then tried to speak to Naalin again. "I know you do not understand half the words I say, but maybe I will try to speak them." Roevash shyly looked over at Naalin. He thought she was holding his tankard like a shield between them, and she was staring. With a long sigh, he tried to relax. Roevash turned back to the glowing flames in the hearth and rubbed his hand on his face. He took a deep breath and started over. "I have lived through many battles of men and elves, the Great War," and the subject abruptly changed. "I swear I have met you somewhere in my past." Roevash turned to Naalin again and looked deeply into her eyes. "It was all so long ago." He paused for a moment, trying to think, trying to remember, but he was so distracted by her ethereal loveliness. Roevash's brain started to hum loudly, drowning out what was left of his cognitive abilities. "I was once a ranger in Eijlam Henny," he blurted out, trying to fill in the silence between them. "Eijlam Henny," Naalin echoed the word. She mimicked his expression. Her cute face made Roevash smile bashfully. He hadn't felt this incapable since his youth. He didn't know what to say, so he just kept rambling on. "There was nothing but death and darkness and fighting for so long." Roevash looked sad from the long memory that always lay in wait to flood his mind. Naalin understood battle weariness. She too had suffered and witnessed many atrocities in her long memory. She didn't know how to comfort him, so she stood up and gave him back his drink. As Roevash's hand took the tankard from her, their fingers touched. A flash of something familiar passed through Naalin's mind. She suddenly recognized Roevash's face and couldn't help but feel the shock of an age past. "I will never forget you." She whispered an echo of her own words from that time. Roevash took a quick gulp of ale, splashing a bit down the front of himself. He started to wipe it off, but was paralyzed by Naalin's sudden closeness. Peering straight into his eyes, she leaned in and gently kissed his large, full mouth. Roevash's insides melted into a burning pile as Naalin lingered on his lips. With her soft fingertips holding both sides of his cheeks, now sure of her memory, Naalin kissed him again. Roevash did not back away. With her face so close, he could smell her sweet breath exhaled lightly on his skin. Not exactly knowing her words, he could only stare at her as she studied him. Her voice was musically lilting as she tried to explain. Ro did not stop her from climbing into his lap to get closer. The tankard dropped to the floor, spilling its contents as he wrapped his arms around her. Roevash and Naalin kissed with a hunger that would not be denied. He felt the full burn of his passion come alive. Face to face, he lifted Naalin and carried her to his bedroom. Desperate to touch each other's skin, they peeled one another out of their clothes. Piece by piece, each garment flew onto the floor. Suddenly, awkward in sharing his nakedness, Roevash froze, afraid of what he was. He looked fearfully at Naalin's beautiful face, not wanting to stop but forcing himself to step back. I am like a human. I'm not. He shook his head, distressed by the distorted perception he had of himself that he'd clung to all his life. Naalin gently took him by the hand and pulled Roevash into her warm embrace. He had never seriously been with anyone, nor did he think he could ever be with anyone. Naalin shared her feelings with Ro, the only way she could think of when words fail. Love will always find a way if you let it. Fear is what causes complications, and fear only exists in your own mind. Be brave, my friends, as you go out into the real world, and remember the lessons as taught to us by these young elves. Even if you don't understand, time and patience will bring the answers to you eventually. We have just made it through slightly more than half of Tales of Eldalorn Book 1, and we're closing in on the season finale. Here's a perfect opportunity for you to tell all your friends it's time to binge listen. And now for my public service warning. I have been saying from the beginning, Tales of Eldalorn is a dark fantasy. As we weave our fingers hand in hand with the elves, they will lead us down that path. But don't worry, Karleigh is not ghosting you. You have this opportunity to listen to some of the old episodes that you never heard before. And I'm also creating another mixtape project of all the featured music from Season 2. I also created a blooper reel, but I'm not so sure how that's going. Seems like that's more of a you had to be there kind of situation. Anywho, how about Naalin? She turned out to be kind of an awesome individual, even in the face of inept indecision. I'm biting my lip on this one, but I kind of get the feeling that Roevash is a 500-year-old virgin, or at least he was until the end of the story, right? And with that said, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Elvish Lesson of the Day. You know how we always call the elves the fair folk? Well, that's just wrong, because fair is a word that elves call the mortal ones, or humans. So fair means human. But the proper word for human is fir, F-I-R. A group of humans is fir-rim. All of the humans are iath. I sense a pattern on the endings of these words, similar to the ones I shared about dragons, wizards, and elves. Beyond all the formalities, if your elven friend calls you fair, now you know they're calling you mortal one. I kind of like that, so you can call me fair anytime you want. I bet you didn't see that one coming.